Here are 3 civilizations that need new commanders. There are so many civilizations in Rise of Kingdoms, and a lot of them don't get talked about because of their stats, but a lot of them also just don't have commanders. So in today's video, I want to go over civilizations that should get new commanders, if nothing else, to just increase the discussion about them as a civilization. First, we have the Vikings. Upon release, they did have a lot of hype, and they're very popular choice-wise for infantry players, but the commanders are lacking. Outside of Herald, there really isn't any meta, so it'd be nice to see them brought back to the forefront of the meta. Next are the Ottomans. Similarly, they really haven't had anything going for them, and they haven't really had a significant commander that makes them able to be talked about. So it would be nice to see them included. And you add on the fact that they have such a wide historical range from medieval to modern, you have a lot of commander selection. Last, but certainly not least, we have Japan. Outside of Minamoto and Takeda and Honda, there really hasn't been a lot to talk about, and I'd love to see them be able to be talked about right now. Here's what your favorite troop type says about you. If you like archers, you are all about the damage, because it doesn't matter which commander you pick up as an archer commander, they put out insane damage. This is coming from a Cav player. It is crazy how much damage archer commanders are able to put out. Between YSG, Liang, Boudica, Nebu, every single one of them has so much damage boost that it is just, it's like trying to fight a porcupine, and it is insanely damaging to deal with. However, it is offset by the fact that most archer commanders tend to be pretty glass cannon-y, and that's a high risk, high reward playstyle, and most players who are archer mains are pretty okay with that because the damage output is totally respectable, and you guys are must-haves in the rally meta. So keep doing what you're doing because we need those flags to start burning. Here's what your favorite troop type says about you. If you're an infantry player, you're not necessarily big about the flashy mobility or the huge damage, but you want to have staying power. And whether that is by being as tanky as possible, by using a shield, by being able to hop in and out of nodes, whatever commander you're using, you are all about survivability. And that's admirable. You also probably like providing support to allies or helping defend a position due to the fact that the naturally low mobility is typically offset by defensive abilities. So you may be a lot harder to take down than that average Cav player. And you probably enjoy that a little bit, especially since you counter that. But no matter what, you play an important role to the kingdom, you play an important role to your garrisons and to your field force. So keep doing what you're doing. Here are 3 future smite damage commanders I would love to see in Rise of Kingdoms. First would be a Cav rally, either to fully replace Attila or to go directly alongside him. Having a variety of damage sources is healthy for the meta and keeps the overall rallying garrison meta fluid. And Cavs could definitely use that damage variety to keep the pressure on and keep the rally meta healthy and varied. The second I would like to see is an archer garrison that does smite damage. This would be great to go alongside Dido, as well as going alongside Heraclius as well. But having an archer garrison overall that does a ton of smite damage and normal attack damage would be refreshing in the skill damage heavy archer meta and give something alternative for the archers. Last, but certainly not least, I would love to see a smite-based leadership garrison. Due to the fact that Heraclius is so recent, I imagine this is quite some time out, but a leadership garrison to go with Hera that make a swarm-resistant monster garrison would be quite refreshing to see. It would provide a great variety of defense options. Another frequent question I have been getting as of the release of iconic tiers is whether refining or iconic tiering is better for your blueprints. Since iconic tiers require blueprints, both have conflicting costs. The same goes for legendary material investment. So which should you pursue first? First, I'll speak in favor of iconicing first. Iconic tiers are guaranteed, meaning you don't have to risk a plus 25 instead of the full 100 refine, giving a guaranteed, although reduced, boost to your overall strength. It's also worth mentioning that iconic tiers are affected by the expertise, but the expertise doesn't have to be attained before the iconic tier to get the bonus, meaning you can iconic now and refine later. Next, in favor of refining first, refining gives a higher overall stat boost for the investment, even at the maximum for refines, which means that overall greater rewards is in refining over a longer term, even if you don't get the guaranteed stats on the first try. As with most things in this game, the decision's ultimately yours, as both have merit. Here are 3 talent trees most desperately in need of buffs or reworks in Rise of Kingdoms. For red trees, the leadership tree is the most in need of a rework. While the integration tree is also really awful, the leadership tree affects far more commanders, and puts many mixed unit commanders behind relevance due to their generally weak talent utility. Next, for blue trees, we have the defense tree. While the attack tree is equally bad, the defense tree is on far more commanders and holding them back, and the ones that are on are certainly held back by overall weak options within the tree, the keystone talent being generally awful for consistency for the talent investment. Last, and most probably least, for the yellow trees is the versatility tree. There's just nothing on this tree that warrants investment, and it pretty much breaks with the overall goal of consistency that you want in your commander talents, with everything being completely inconsistent and just adding a lot of randomness that you don't need in the game. Here are the top 5 Garrison Pairs in Rise of Kingdoms right now. Note that due to how each garrison better covers different situations, these aren't necessarily in ranked order. First, we have Gorgo Hera. The only real weakness is weak talent selections for a mixed defense, but the pros are just so strong that it's impossible to overlook its relevance. Next, we have Jan Hera. I am still a huge proponent of Jan Hera, and I still think that it's right at the top area of the list, even with Dino Gorgo after him. He's just too versatile. Next, we have Xeno Gorgo and Gorgo Constantine. This is a double entry here, as they both do similar things with increased normal damage, and are the only first full white damage pairings for Garrison, with Xeno only having skill damage on a passive proc and are incredibly solid. Next, we have Hera YSS, which is only weakened by poor talent selection and the need for leadership gear to reach its full potential, but is insanely versatile. Last, but certainly not least, we have Dino Hera, which is still very much alive in the meta, even after the release of Gorgo. Welcome back to Museum Relics Reviewed. In this episode, we have YSG and Minamoto. First, YSG. You get a 20% defense and 5% skill damage bonus at tier 2. While it's not health, the defense definitely helps with survivability, and the skill damage further helps his 5-target AoE, making him a viable secondary March pair and earning a solid A-. Next, we have Minamoto. Minamoto gets 30% defense and 30% attack at max level. However, Minamoto really needed health with this relic, as he has very little defensively going for him and loses a skill to barbarian skills, making him very vulnerable. And as much as the relic is nice for PvE and barbarians, it's not necessarily enough to make him valuable, making him a solid B for his utility. Welcome to another episode of Museum Relics Reviewed in Rise of Kingdoms. In this episode, we have Martel and Mehmed. First, Martel. Martel gives 35% attack and a meager 10% health at tier 2. If these were swapped, it would be a godsend for him, giving him some survivability. But the lack of skill or smite damage in his kit doesn't really bring enough to the table on its own, especially when you have an augmented skill on expertise and a garrison skill for city only, giving you essentially 2 skills that are actually field useful, letting Martel at a meager C for his relic. Next, we have Mehmed, who gets a massive 30% health and 10% skill damage at tier 2. This is an awesome return from Mehmed, and although it hasn't made him a full meta staple, it is exactly what a commander like him needs to keep up with the power creep in the game and to keep him somewhat relevant in the off-field meta, and gets a solid A from me. Welcome to another Museum Relic review. In this episode, we have Sid and Richard. First, we have Sid. Sid gets 25% attack and a 300 skill damage bonus on his tier 2 relic. This is one of the worst relics overall, and the biggest need that Sid had was survivability. This relic provides none of it. With an Archer March with 0 bonus health, no AoE, or no other way to deter people from being near him, this relic puts him at a meager D rank. Next, we have Richard. Richard gets a 15% March speed bonus and 6% counterattack bonus. While this does not by any means make him a meta commander in PvP, this has an interesting effect on his active skill, since his active skill slows enemies, keeping his mobility up and slowing enemies, making him an interesting off-meta 2nd or 3rd infantry march options if you're slowing down enemies in an ambush-style play at choke points, getting a decent B- when you add in his PvE viability. Welcome to another episode of Pairing Pro Con. In this episode, we're comparing pairings for Gorgo. First, we have Flavius, which has good damage and resistances with Hold the Line when you use pure infantry, and has great damage output and good counterattack resistance with Flavius. However, it is poor unit flexibility due to the fact that you need pure infantry to use the best of Flavius's talents. Next, we have Zenobia, which similarly has great swarm resistance with good white damage output, and just natural swarm resistance with an insane amount of health, but has generally weak unit flexibility since you need all infantry for Hold the Line, and not a lot of damage to deal with meta archers and get past those rallies. Next, we have YSS, which has great unit flexibility and very, very respectable damage output, since his buffs are to all damage and not just skill damage, but you lose out to hold the line, and the talent selection is generally poor. And last but certainly not least, with Heraclius, you similarly have great unit flexibility and insane tankiness, but weak talent selection, and you can't use hold the line. Welcome to another episode of Pairing Pro Con. In this episode, we're going over pairing options for Joan Prime. First, we're going to go over is William. Joan William is a top level support with a bunch of rage gain and minimal head investments because you can only do 5-1-1-5 and 5-5-5-1 with Joan and William respectively and still be a great contributor. However, it comes at the cost of some damage lost, and you are very, very squishy with this commander pairing. Next, we have Nevsky, which is a great balance of damage, solid debuff, good mobility, and good ally buffs, but at the cost of being somewhat easily swarmable and losing Nevsky to other pairings that could possibly be better. Last, but certainly not least, we have Woe, who has insane damage, solid sustain with the heal, but is fairly fragile just like Nevsky is, and not nearly as supportive as the other pairings, leaving yourself a little less productive for your allies. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode, we have Zenobia squaring off against Flavius. First, Zenobia. Zenobia has a huge buff on her primary skill, which buffs health, and most importantly, normal attack damage, making her extremely painful to swarm and very resilient against many sources of damage since she has good damage resistances. On top of that, the normal attack damage buffs make her an ideal candidate to pair with Gorgo, sealing her viability in the current meta. Next, we have Flavius. Flavius is no slouch and puts out his damage primarily through his huge single target primary skill, as well as great counterattack bonus. Adds on stacking poison debuff that increases damage taken from infantry, and a silence on enemies when below 50% health due to the additional damage on his primary, and you have an incredibly solid but also damaging defense setup. But unfortunately only one can win, although it's tough. Zenobia gets the edge here due to the fact that she's a much better pairing for Gorgo. Welcome to another episode of Commander Versus. In this episode we have Boudica Prime squaring off against Hermann Prime in a battle of the primes. First, Boudica. Boudica has a great single target damage on her primary with an instant debuff that hits a single target and is great normal attack damage bonuses to resist swarm, as well as a natural resistance to debuffs on her expertise, making her difficult to deal with and a great team contributor both as a support debuffer and a damage dealer. Next, for Hermann, you get an AoE damage and debuff on the primary skill, which can stack to even greater heights over time, as well as a defense debuff on his third skill, making for a great level of debuff and a higher skill damage taken overall on multiple enemies, although at a significantly more fragile setup to do so. However, only one commander can be crowned, and although it's very close, Hermann does edge out Boudica here due to the impact of multiple target debuffs. However, I imagine Boudica will also be significant for quite some time.